was in itself was kind of odd for a child that age. She was about 13 years old. And she came in with a newspaper, and on it was the banner. It was, the headline was, "Gangs Ruining Neighborhood." And there below was a picture of her and a bunch of her buddies sitting in front of the local 7-Eleven store. And I thought, now that's kind of an interesting start to a conversation. And then, so I sort of said to her, well, that's kind of interesting, just sit down. And said, well, you're here because you don't go to school. And she got right indignant, And this child actually, this indignant, this kind of energy, this girl kind of energy kind of makes sense because she's growing up in quite severe poverty, subsidized housing. Her mother has severe addictions. She doesn't know who her father is, to tell you the truth. I also knew that she was, what had happened over the years was as men had come into the home to be with her mother, she had been sexually abused in some cases, physically abused often. She'd witnessed intimate partner violence with her mother as well. This was a chaotic world for this girl. And when she had adapted to that, when she was about 12 years old, a year or two before I met her, she'd begun to sort of take a knife, and any man who came into the house and threatened her mother, or indeed herself or her younger sister, she would just chase out of the house with a knife. So her whole persona had become this kind of tough kid. And when I was kind of getting to know her, I said, well, I hear you don't go to school, and that's kind of a problem because your social worker's upset, the police are upset, you got to do it. And she said, I go to school. I said, sorry, you go to school? She said, yeah. So at this point, you take your assessment or your referral and you throw it to the side. You go to school. When do you go to school? She says, well, I have this grade 7 teacher named Mrs. Smith. Let's call her Mrs. Smith. And she's really a newbie teacher, and she really sucks at getting the class to quiet down. So I sometimes go to school to help her. Now, you gotta follow me on this. So I'm in my office, and well, how do you help Mrs. Smith? And she says, so she goes into this long explanation of how when Mrs. Smith can't quiet the class down, put aside your cell phones, tension up here, come on now. She's mimicking this teacher who's obviously like a Miss Honey or something from Matilda. Anyways, at some point she says, well, I said, what did you do? And she said, well, what I did was, she sucked to get in the class to quiet down, so what I did was, and she does this in my office, she got up on the chair, she puts 2 fingers in her mouth can someone do one of those whistles? Somebody. Thank you, that's what she does. She does that, and then supposedly in her classroom, she shouts at the top of her lungs, shut up! Except she doesn't miss the middle word. Wow. And obviously it had the desired effect, as you can imagine if you did that in a grade 7 classroom, everyone quiets down. So I went over, I looked at her and said, well, what did the teacher do next? And supposedly her teacher comes over to her, looks up at her on the chair, and says, thank you. Now, that teaches, wherever teachers go in terms of heaven, I think that she's headed there or whatever. It was kind of a remarkable story. But what caught my attention about it was that then the teacher afterwards said to her, after class, said, please don't stand on the furniture and don't use the F word when you're going to help. But what caught my attention was that child, though on the surface looks very vulnerable, lots of psychopathology, lots of disordered behaviors, lots of trouble, gang involvement, etc., etc. But actually, if you scratch the surface, she's being motivated by a set of practice things in her that are actually signs of resilience if we can look for them. Now, I call that hidden resilience because it's not always obvious to us. But she was super easy to work with because what I had to do then was to simply invite her to come to school, not to learn math and English, but I invited her to school, with the permission of the school, to become a peer mentor to other young people. She was great at coaching other kids on how to deal with their social workers, and the courts as well, right? She'd been through it all, right? So, a kid was going to be sexually abused, and she'd coach the kid. Okay, don't tell your social worker this, but you can tell them social worker this. You can manipulate them for more like this. And this was her kind of operation, right? She came to school, she engaged with some positive adults in her life, and by the way, while she was there, eventually, we began to sort of teach her some math and science. Now, I say that because what I'm beginning to understand is that we need to sort of shift the conversation away from psychopathology. And I get the sense, Jerry, in your comments that this is the tone of the day. That we're moving away from just talking about the trauma and more towards what are the protective factors in young people's lives. Because we know this kind of stuff. Those of you, I'm sure you've probably encountered the adverse childhood experience studies. The ACE studies are quite popular. We know that these 10 things that young people could experience before the age of 18 are highly predictive of later developmental problems such as depression later in life and this everything. And that the more of those negative things that happen to you, the more likely you are to have depression and heart disease and sexual promiscuity and a bunch of other sort of somatic illnesses, et cetera, in your adult years. But if you look at this chart, it sort of says, the prevalence of adult depression is linked to early experiences of trauma. What we often forget is two things. First of all, if I could go back there for a second, that list, if you think about it, is totally amenable to social policy. There's not one of the 10 big adverse childhood experiences that cannot be changed simply by the reactions of the courts, the way social services are designed, good governance, social policies. Every one of those can be brought down in their frequency, and every one of those could actually, within one generation, we could change who is in our court systems, and indeed who's in our social welfare systems and our mental health facilities. We know this. The other important thing, if I could, about those stats is this, that actually more people survive those experiences than actually succumb to them, which is actually what people like myself who study resilience and others you're going to hear today actually focus on. In other words, 51% of people who have 4 or more of those adverse childhood experiences actually do quite well in life and don't suffer depression. And when I actually asked Robert Anda, who's one of the architects from the Centers for Disease Control in the US, how does he explain this 51%? And he made a profound statement back to me. He said, "We don't know." Because we never thought to ask. The whole focus of the industry is on predicting the bottom of the bar graph, and very little attention has been paid to the top of the bar graph. Now, this gets particularly interesting for us in sort of this kind of work as well. Let me just kind of give you some stats, because I tried to look up some numbers. This is not my core area of expertise, so I defer if there's better academics in the room that want to sort of correct me on some of the numbers here. But essentially what we know is that these days, about 56% of US children, sorry I don't have the Canadian stats, will live with both their biological parents until the age of 12. In other words, a lot of them are going to experience disruptions in their lives. And this, of course, is affected by income and race as well. And of course, we know that, again, with American children, about 44% of them are going to experience the serial monogamy of a parent. Now, in other words, children are going to go through a fair bit of disorder in their lives in terms of these separations. And in fact, single moms and single dads, of course, but single moms seem to be getting back into relationships within 5 years of a divorce. Okay, now that's like the negative story again, right? And I've been working with Dr. Kristen Hadfield on some of this work. And what she contends in her work is that, in fact, the family instability hypothesis is a bit overblown. We've been so focused on the psychopathology that relates to family instability that we've almost missed that actually most kids do reasonably well from all this. And in fact, children can in fact report some very positive experiences as a result of their parents' serial monogamy, that they can actually get something. I mean, let's face it, if you're in a very abusive home and your parents separate, you probably are better off than if the parents stayed together. But that's not the dominant discourse of our time. And what's furthermore, if you actually get thinking about this a little bit, right? Sorry, this is kind of backwards here, but essentially, what we really need to do is pay attention to the fact that children could report positive experiences if, as parents go through this serial monogamy, the children themselves are able to maintain relationships with the parents, the individuals who come through the home. In other words, if we think about it from the point of view of the child and not us as adults, what you can actually begin to see is that perhaps children are gaining resources by their parents actually having multiple partners. Now that only works, of course, if in fact that person that comes into the home is benign, which is not the case for the girl who I just talked about on the chair. In other words, the study of resilience points us in a slightly different direction, away from the problem and back to understanding the world and the protective mechanisms as they operate in children's lives themselves. And all this leads me to, in a sense, conclude that if I'm going to study resilience, I'm going to need to start thinking about first and foremost, the nature of the adversity that a child is experiencing. You see, I'm not a positive psychologist, no offense to my colleagues who are positive psychologists. Positive psychology talks about kids, well, I have 5 kids. They talk about kids like mine that don't really have a great deal of barriers to their life, right? But what I'm getting at is that when you add adversity into a child's life, you have to sort of understand this dance between what they're experiencing and what protective mechanisms can actually trigger. And this has profound influence, I'm going to argue, on the work that you're all doing. So, if you understand the severity and the chronicity of the abuse or the violence that a child's experienced, if you also understand at what ecological level, so a child that's just experienced a divorce that's not that conflictual, they've maintained the same house, the same community, the same school, the same socioeconomic status, they're perhaps not even, they're from that type of thing, they're not terribly marginalized or bullied or otherwise. If none of those other ecological levels are out of whack and they just have this one sort of experience of a bad event, they're probably not going to be that badly traumatized. Attributions of causality, do they blame themselves for causing a disruption in their life? And indeed, what's the cultural and contextual norms that they live with? Boy, that's a lot of factors to factor in. It's no longer just, oh my God, you got divorced, you must be worse off. Suddenly, by assessing all these other factors, we're beginning to understand that we have to be thinking in more complex terms about this. And what we know about resilience is that when there's relatively low risk, interventions that promote cognitive change, mindfulness-based practices, those kinds of things, they work. And they work quite well, not terribly sustainable, by the way, but they kind of work well, at least in the interim. And they can teach self-regulation and all these other good things that you've probably been hearing the buzzwords about. But they tend to work better when they're in contexts where there's very little risk exposure. As you move up and you start talking about lower SES, you start talking about racism, you're an immigrant or a refugee from another country, you start talking about where you're racially profiled, where you're pushed aside by society, where you have severe learning challenges, where you're in underfunded schools, etc., etc. You start talking about those kinds of contexts, and frankly, it's never going to be enough to simply have a program to build resilience which is focused on changing the individual's thinking. And what we're now understanding is you also have to think about what are the availability of other external resources. Do they have safe housing, safe streets, good schools, good teachers, good mentors, social programs, this kind of thing? What's the accessibility of those resources? How can they even manage to use those resources? And what's the positive reinforcement back for using those resources and how adaptive is their environment? So the girl on the chair essentially said, look, I have a shitstorm of problems. I am not just going to be able to sort of be taught how to cope with this individually. You've got to stabilize my home, keep me away from the sexually abusive predators who come into my home. You've got to provide me with an education that's adapted to my needs. I've got to stabilize my housing, and my mom is addicted and everything else. And the more that those resources were put into place as part of a comprehensive package, the more she went into a more socially desirable pathway, of which one of those was getting her to engage at school in a place where she felt safe, was with adults, and was able to show some of the talents that she actually had. There's also, of course, an element here of whether or not there's a temporal dimension here. I mean, it's amazing, but what we know about resilience is that it looks different in different cultures, in different contexts, and at different times. A colleague of mine in the UK, Ingrid Schoon, who's done some work on this, argues quite emphatically that depending on whether or not you were growing up under Thatcher or Blair, what resources you had to be resilient and how you're going to cope in your society is going to affect very much the kinds of choices that you make every day. And that's because there's an interplay between your context and who you are. Now, this gets even, I mean, if I can add, like, I'm a scientist, right? So I'm supposed to, get down to the science that underpinning all this. This has all been sort of, if you want to read the academic articles, they're there. But let's bring some, if you can tolerate this, let's bring in some hardcore science. Here we go. All right, so let's think about this for a minute. You all, I'm sure, are familiar with the image of Cinderella, and Cinderella's story is always told as one of a resilient child, right? And my apologies, by the way, I'm using the Disney version of Cinderella, which of course propagates a certain incredibly mildly racist image of her is very white, and of course a very sexist image of her, portraying her in a certain kind of portrayal for gender here, her sex. So with all those caveats, because this is still the most propagated image of Cinderella, it seems these days, you know, the story of Cinderella is always told as like, you know, this kid kind of comes out of great adversity, her mother dies, and then her father dies, and then she's raised with this evil stepmom. Stepmoms always get a bad rap in these stories. And then she kind of, you know, she has this kind of goodness of, she has this, you know, foundation stones for empathy and stuff, and she makes friends with birds and mice and other things. And then she kind of, you know, and along comes the fairy godmother who kind of basically can turn pumpkins into golden carriages. I mean, which of us would not do better if we didn't have someone who could turn a pumpkin into a golden carriage, and it's a very nice asset to have in our life. And then, you know, she kind of is whisked off, and she has the right shoe size and everything else, and she manages to enchant the prince, and she lives happily ever after. I mean, this is really the Meghan Markle story, right? Absolutely. This is a perfect fit. Now, let me, though, tell you, I think the entire story is all wrong, because it's labeled Cinderella story, but it's not actually about Cinderella at all. You think it is because we're couched in this kind of neoliberal, hyper-individualistic idea that somehow Cinderella did well and she was resilient. But that's not true. The real story here all hinges on the fairy godmother. Let me do the story again without the fairy godmother. Fairy godmother ain't there. Well, Cinderella is this abused child living